Howdy doody buckaroonies, and welcome back to another episode of Grumpy Mustache Takes Big Stinky Poo Poo on Unison Audio. Recently, my wife and I watched Stranger Things Season 4, and it was pretty okay, I guess. But once again, I found myself really struck by the music of Stranger Things. I feel like throughout every season, the original soundtrack has been really good. So today, I thought it would be fun to take a stab at creating a sort of retro-inspired synth score, and more importantly, talk a little bit about what makes retro synthy stuff sound like retro synthy stuff, so that you can try some of these ideas and techniques for yourself to go out and make something. So as usual, please consider this a homework assignment for yourself to go out and try some of this stuff and let me know how it turns out. Today's video is sponsored by Softtube, who just released their new Model 82 synthesizer plugin. We'll be using that alongside their Model 72 and Model 84 plugins to make our epic retro synth-based score. You don't need these to accomplish this, but of course they do help because they do sound really damn good. A very big thank you to Softtube for sponsoring today's video and supporting the channel, and of course, if you want to check out these plugins for yourself, you can find those all linked down in the description below. Because we're going to be talking about what makes retro synth soundtracks sound so retro, let's talk about a few of the exciting developments of the 1980s outside of cheetah print and cocaine. In the 80s, digital hardware was all the rage, with things like big digital reverbs being an iconic part of the 80s sound. Polyphony at the time was also still relatively new. Chords and big chord stacks were all the rage, and since players wanted to make use of all these new voices they're getting access to, they're often using more complex chord voicings, which are a big part of what makes those 80s synth chord stabs sound so 80s. Aside all the exciting advancements of the digital and solid-state realm, analog technology was still in heavy use. Despite the SSL sound and solid-state tech coming into the studio more and more, there was still a fair amount of analog tape and tube-based processors, giving things that warmth and imperfection we all know and love, while balanced with a sort of digital and modern precision. A big part of the synth signature sound of the 80s was also a combination of these realms of digital and analog, with synthesizers like the DX7, WaveStation, PPG Wave, or Roland D50 playing along with classics like the Juno, Jupiter, Prophet, and all the other usual suspects. And that's the news of the 80s, so let's wipe off last night's no sugar and hop into the DAW to get things started. Alright, so here we are with the core idea. Lately, I've actually found myself working a lot with clips to come up with arrangements and ideas, because it's a fast way to come up with lots of little themes and loops and mix and match them to find a lot of different sections and quick variations. So I find it's a very efficient way to work. Let's work through the basic sound palette here. First up, coming from Model 72, I have this nice big thunky kick drum, and that's just going to be kind of the core element throughout the entire track. From Model 82, we have this nice plucky ARP lead thing. In another Model 82, I have this really cool sort of noisy effect transition thing, and that's just used to bridge different sections together. From another Model 82, I got this cool bass preset, but I pitched it up really high and turned that into the lead, which I thought sounded really nice. It has this bright cutting quality that worked really well. Below that, we have probably one of my favorite sounds on this track. This is coming from Model 84. It's this cool arpeggiated patch. I put an arpeggiator before Model 84 in Bitwig to get the arpeggiated sound, and then I ran that through an auto painter, but the real sauce comes from GateLab. GateLab is a really cool free plugin that generates different gate rhythms, and I have this generating a new set of rhythms every time it cycles, so it's never the same twice. So if we give this a play in context, you'll hear what it's doing, and it sounds really cool. So definitely not something you would really hear in like an 80s synth authentically, but it's just a cool sort of modern twist on it that I think adds a bit of flavor to the overall sonic palette. Below that, I've got another Model 84 providing a big bass. Sort of a Reese Hoovery type thing, just fills out the low end. Yet another Model 82 here with a cool noise transition. Kind of like the other effect patch, just using this to bridge sections together. Another Model 82 with this really cool gurgly filter thing, and this is also used as just sort of an effect hit now and again to accent different sections of the track. A really glorious pad patch here from Model 84 running through a bit of baby audio spaced out to create this really lovely pad and ambience. And finally, one more Model 72 here with this really bright bell sound and a bit of auto panning on it that just kind of adds some contrast to all the other elements in this track. With all those elements put together, I've arranged it out to create the basis of the track. We have the intro, sort of the main section here, kind of a B section, sort of chills out, bit darker feeling. Another section, much more dark and simplified. And the outro. Which is a lot darker and more chilled out. To fill out the track here, I've got a delay and reverb, so putting all that together really starts to feel nice. Definitely feels pretty big, even though it's just a handful of elements. An important thing I want to point out here is that you can see there's really not a whole lot going on, and this is to remain somewhat appropriate to the era, because back in the day we didn't have DAWs with infinite numbers of tracks. We were talking maybe 8, 16, 32, or 48 channels of stuff you could do. So in this case, we want to really try and simplify and try and focus on getting things that complement each other well and create an effective arrangement and track with as few elements as possible, and try and artificially restrict ourselves to make that happen. And this will lead to a much more authentic and appropriate sounding piece. Sort of building off that point, another important thing to keep in mind here, and another important part of what makes a retro synth score sound retro, is, I guess, what I would call the John Carpenter effect. If you're not familiar with the name, you are certainly familiar with his work. Working on a lot of low-budget films, John Carpenter didn't really have the budget for a professional score and decided to simply do it himself. This led to a very interesting and sort of era-defining sound that became a staple of 80s synth soundtracks for horror and even popular films, aside from some of the AAA film titles, which took a bit more of a glossy and poppy approach. A lot of these old scores feature a few key components: a simple and droning bass line or pulsating arpeggiated bass, since ARP features on synths were pretty new and exciting at the time, simple and somewhat repetitive diatonic melodies and themes that don't really stray outside the scale, and small textural effects and other hits that add a bit of flavor now and again. So as we take these core ideas and build this out into a finished theme, these are the things we want to keep in mind to keep things feeling authentic and appropriate. Okay, with that, let's take a quick sidebar here to talk about what makes 80s chords feel so 80s so that you can try it yourself. In this track, we have a chord progression of G sharp minor, E major, and F sharp major. If you just played things that way, it really doesn't sound very 80s compared to something like this. So why is that? At the time in the 80s, polyphony was still relatively new, so many keyboard players wanted to take advantage of all these fun notes that you could play at the same time. So in the case of something like the Model 82, we have 6 voices, and if we play out just our regular voicing, we might do something like this. This is only using 5 out of 6 possible notes, so let's bring in a 6th note from the scale, and something like, I don't know, let's do a 4 here. That feels a bit more 80s, so let's take this root here and put it up an octave. And instead of doing a 5th in the bass hand or left hand, we could do an octave. And that's really the magic of it, is more or less just pick one extra note to add in to your right hand. So moving it down to the E major, let's flip that E up an octave, pick another note from the scale, maybe we'll do the F sharp, and ta-da, finally going to our F sharp major. Let's pick one other note from the scale, maybe something like the, let's do the G sharp up here. That's really uncomfortable to hold, so let's move that up an octave. And let's maybe move our thumb up to a B and drop this down to an octave in the left hand. Ta-da! Magical 80s chords. If that was really confusing to you though, and you need to learn more about how to find what notes are in a scale, I would definitely recommend checking out Hook Theory. I've got a link to them down in the description below. They actually have a free chart for every key and every scale to let you know what notes are in it. So in this case, if you wanted to write something out of G sharp minor like I did, you can reference their chart to help you build out the chords. So with all that chord stuff in mind, I brought in a couple big chord stabs here using 2 layers of Model 84, which sounds like this. Which is just such an immensely satisfying sound, especially when you bring in a big bass line underneath it. Praise Mary and pass the butter, that is juicy. So with all that, I built out an arrangement here and brought in a handful of other elements just to add those bits of ear candy and make things a bit more interesting. One of the first things I brought in was another Model 82 sound here. Totally unquantized, just adding these sort of little texture hits now and again and throughout this A section. And then one little section here just to bridge between the B section and the sort of beginning of the outro. Another thing I brought in was down here coming from Model 72. This is something you find in a lot of retro scores for some reason, where there's just sort of one little theme or one sort of little sound that only happens once and is never brought in. It's not really like a theme or a motif that occurs throughout the soundtrack. It's just in every track there seems to be one little thing, so I just added that in here in the A section. Moving forward from Model 72, I brought in this really cool lead. Had a really cool spooky sound to it, and I layered that with a bass from Model 82 to create that kind of pulsing, arpeggiated bass feel for this B section thing. Which seemed to fit nicely. Moving forward from there, I just created kind of a variation on this idea. I used that same bass line on another Model 82 with a slightly different sound. Bit darker and greasier, and also fed that through a delay for sort of a different groove and bounce. And then I brought in a Model 72 here with that super bright sound from earlier and just had it way high up, which contrasted nicely with this big, deep bass line. And that was really it. This is the point where I like to bring in all the ear candy and transition effects and other things like that. This is mostly just to add, again, that little bit of modern sensibility to the score here to make it a bit more fun and interesting to listen to while still remaining era appropriate to some degree. This definitely starts to violate our sort of 16 tracks and under rule, but that's okay because it makes it sound way more fun. So I brought in just some impacts and effects, some cool risers and stuff. A couple little extra effects, and then in the outro section, I brought in some additional noise and other things that I ran through things like GateLab and added some processing to create these cool kind of ticking textures that just add some pacing and make things feel a little bit more dark. So now it's time to mix everything down, and for this I used PSP Infinistrip. This is a channel strip plugin, and this is because back in the day you were often mixing on consoles and stuff. You didn't have super powerful spectral dynamic EQs and EQs with 100,000 bands and 83 billion multi-band compressors and distortions and things like that. It was very much cut and dry. You had a preamp, a filter, a 4-band EQ if you were lucky, a compressor, and maybe ran it all to a tape machine. So with that in mind, we can emulate these sort of mixing techniques of the era by emulating a channel strip that would probably be something pretty common in the era. So diving in, you can really see this is the case everywhere. I just copied the Infinistrip chain over. There's a couple extra things now and again, like the auto pans and gate lab. I've got a filter automation here at the beginning and a couple other little modern tweaks on stuff, but for the most part, it is a very era-appropriate mixing technique. I've got a console by using the same channel strip, only a handful of sends, and that's really it. So with all that in mind, we've created an era-appropriate synth-based cinematic score using a handful of techniques like era-appropriate gear or plugin emulations, era-appropriate arranging techniques, era-appropriate theory and voicings, and era-appropriate mixing and other little bits and bobs, with a few exceptions for those modern sensibilities just to make it a bit more fun to listen to. So with that, let's take a listen to the final result. And I guess that's my time for this one. That is my take on a retro cinematic synth-inspired score using only a handful of ultimately pretty basic synthesizers, and I think it turned out pretty cool. Of course, be sure to consider this as a homework assignment for yourself to go out and try some of this and see what you can make, and let me know how it turns out. A big thank you to SoftTube once again for sponsoring today's video and helping to support the channel, and a big thank you to you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something, and as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.